Great, thank you very much. I come from a regulator, but I'm not really here to talk about regulation. But I am here to talk about the evidence base that we compile at Ofcom. So my job is Director of Market Intelligence at Ofcom, and my team broadly has responsibility for assembling the evidence base that we use to inform our policy programme. And increasingly, and I'll come into the context for this, we are assembling a very rich evidence base around people's use of attitudes to the internet, and indeed as an industry side revenue data set as well, which is quite difficult for us, frankly, because the data sets are enormous, they're varied, and we haven't got any statutory powers in the same way that we do for broadcast and telecoms. So most of what I'm going to talk through today is from our online nation report. This was the first year we published it this year. It's going to be an annual publication. Alongside a sort of a narrative report, there is an interactive data set. So I'd really encourage you to go and have a look at that. It really is, I believe, probably the best data set that you will have available into use of attitudes to the internet in the UK. Right, so moving on. So why have we done this report for the first time? You may say it's overdue. I think the first reason is that use of online is clearly massively disrupting the traditional services that we regulate. So there's just some data around the use of mobile phones. Probably the most telling bit there is that 12 minutes, the average frequency that people in the UK use their smartphones. So we collected that data based on a panel of Android users, about 5,000 of them, and we monitored every time their screen became active, and it's an average of 12 minutes. So sort of moving on from that a little bit, so clearly the use of online is massively disrupting traditional services, television services, and this is just quite telling, I think. So you look at the decline of TV viewing, so you look at the average television viewing, which is that blue dotted line, declined by 50 minutes since between 2012 and 2018. You look at the two bottom lines, 16 to 24-year-olds in orange and children, 4 to 15 in purple, and their television viewing has about halved in the last 5 or 6 years, and if anything, it's accelerating. So the donut on the right there shows where this viewing has been going. Increasingly for young people, you can split viewing into 3 increasingly equal portions between broadcast television, between online video, particularly YouTube, and broadcast video on demand services such as Netflix. So of course these changes are driving massive growth in the volumes of data across the UK's fixed and mobile infrastructure. Colours on the slide I've got a bit wrong there, but I hope it's pretty evident. 240 gigabytes per month in 2018, that was June 2018. That's from our Connected Nations report, so an update will be available in December, and a similar sort of scale of growth in mobile, although clearly much more traffic over fixed infrastructure than mobile. So that's the first reason for why we're sort of assembling this evidence base. The second reason is even more direct. We have specific duties to research and promote media literacy. The key media literacy skills that people need to navigate today's online world are, of course, digital media literacy skills. And so we've kicked off our Making Sense of Media programme, which is intended to make available information on online harms, internet users' attitudes, and their experience of being online. And alongside the online nation report, we published our programmatic tracker research into adults' media use and attitudes. We also have a separate report and data set into children's media attitudes, and we published some research into online harms that we commissioned jointly with the Information Commissioner's Office. So headline findings from that research into online harms are on the slide. So we looked at across a very broad range of online harms, ranging from experiences that you might describe as mildly annoying to those which are seriously harmful. We found around 6 in 10 adults, 8 in 10 12 to 15-year-olds had experienced a potential harm in the last 12 months. The most common harms were related to harmful content on the internet or conduct, so interactions with people. And quite high levels of harm related to data privacy and hacking security as well. So that's the second reason. The third reason is that, I don't need to tell all of you that there's a heck of a lot going on in the public policy forum about to regulate the internet or not to regulate. So I'm sure this list is not definitive, it's probably a little bit out of date, but I hope it just illustrates the point that there's a heck of a lot going on. And of course, Ofcom, communications regulator, is central to a lot of that debate. So moving on into some of the sort of nitty-gritty and what people do online. So this donut shows the time that people spend on the internet. And I think there's probably three things that I'd highlight from that. Firstly, it's a heck of a lot of time. So 3 hours, 15 minutes is the average amount of time that UK adults spent on the internet in 2018. It's a little bit more than the time they spend watching television. Second thing to highlight is how much of that time is on Google, or Google sites including YouTube, in the green, and on Facebook, and Facebook sites including Instagram, WhatsApp in the red. But I would also highlight that big bit of pink at the side. So that's essentially the long tail. So all of the others are the top 15 used internet sites in the UK. So we've then got, 43% of time, 1 hour and 24 minutes spent on sites that are outside the top 15. And so that's just a bit of context if we're thinking about, should regulation focus on the main platforms, or there's a very, very broad range of use. I think it's interesting to look at the revenue story alongside that. So this is how the revenue breaks down across the top 50 internet sites in the UK as measured by time spent. And you'll see there that Google and Facebook accounted for around half of total UK service revenues. And on the right-hand side, a little bit more, 61% of online advertising revenues. So very big players, and I mean the context there is that sort of compares to 36% of the time that is spent. So they're sort of, people are spending a lot of time on these services, but actually the revenues are accounting for a slightly higher proportion. So I talked about mobile a bit earlier. You'll see that sort of green line going up. The question that we asked here is, what is the device that you consider to be the most important device for getting on the internet? And it really does show the growth of the smartphone. So in 2019, more than half of adults in the UK thought that their smartphone was their most important device for getting on the internet. So that is reflected in where people spend their time online. So 75% of time is spent online on mobile devices, either tablets or smartphone, and I see the majority of that is on smartphones. Another interesting thing is this is common for all ages. So 55 plus users of the internet are still spending the majority of their time online on smartphones. Young people are spending the vast majority of their time online on smartphones. And most of that time is accessing internet services through apps. Around half of total time spent, that red, is accessing the internet via an app on a smartphone. And that just raises some questions, or it emphasises the importance to operating systems as the gatekeepers to those mobile apps. And on the left there, we've got the most commonly used apps on iPhone, on the right on Android. And it's interesting to me anyway to see that there are some significant differences between them. So on Android, you see all of the top 10 are either Google's own apps, or 4 of them are Facebook apps. On the iPhone, it's a little different. 3 of the top 10 apps are Apple-owned, 4 of the top 10 are Facebook, and you see YouTube, the difference there. 59% of iPhone users use YouTube, 74% of Android. YouTube is, of course, pre-installed on Android phones and not generally on iPhones. Although, interesting as well, so look at Spotify at 56%. What's that, the 6th most popular app on iPhone, of course in competition with Apple's own Apple Music, but very widely used. So let's move on to look at the collection of user data. So this table shows what Android refer to as dangerous permissions that are requested on Android by the top 10 third-party apps used on Android. So Android classifies permissions as dangerous if they can access a user's private information, affect their stored data, or the operation of other apps. So 7 in 10 of these top 10 apps requested permission to read the user's contacts, often, for example, to sync those contacts to the app. And 9 of them, the only exception is Spotify, wanted to know the user's location. So I think there is sort of quite a strong evidence that, that not all of these, this data that they're collecting is actually needed for delivering the services. So this gives an overall picture of consumers' awareness of how their data is collected. It's not a bad picture in some respects. So 7 in 10 are aware of cookies being used to collect information through websites. 6 in 10 say they know about information being collected from social media accounts, and about half of them are aware of information being collected through smartphone apps. Only 4 in 10, however, say that they're aware of all those methods of collecting. And we find that 69%, I'm actually surprised it's not higher than that, say that they accept terms and conditions without reading them. Of course, that's perhaps not surprising. I think famously at 36,275 words, PayPal's terms and conditions are longer than Shakespeare's Hamlet. I've often thought that would be a good piece of avant-garde theatre, actually. So the purpose of user data collection is, of course, to target content and adverts to people, to enhance the user experience, to drive revenues. When we ask people, we ask the question, I don't mind if organisations use information about me to decide what content they show me or which adverts they show me. Only 17% of them agree, so that's a 4 or 5, that they're happy with that for ads or content. So the business models are requiring this content. The content is being delivered to them. People are not reading terms and services, yet only a small minority are actually happy that this content, this data is used for the purpose for which it's collected. There's also a trust question for some of the biggest sites. So we asked the question here, about whether you trust a company to protect your data and use your data responsibly. And we only asked people who actually said they use those sites. 43% of Facebook users don't trust them to use their data responsibly. 35% of YouTube users. At the other end, however, there's quite high trust amongst Amazon users and users of the BBC News website. So moving on quickly to look at search. So of all the sectors we looked at, search is the most skewed in favour of one player. Virtually everyone saying they use Google, just 14% using the second placed Bing. And of course, there's a heck of a lot of revenue that's generated through search. So there's more revenue generated in the UK through search than there is through television advertising. And virtually every internet user uses search, of course. But there's very mixed understanding of how search engines make their revenue. So our media literacy research showed that only 54% of adults were aware of how search engine websites are funded. Close to 3 in 10 said they were unsure, and nearly 1 in 5, 18% gave an incorrect response. Some people think that search is funded by the government, for example. Each of these measures unchanged since 2017. Also, when we did some qualitative research showing an image of an advert on Google, it was an advert for walking boots, distinguished by a box with the word ad in it. I'm sure you've all seen ads like that. Only 48% of adult search engine users correctly understood that that ad was only there because it was paid for advertising and not because it was the best or most relevant result. So moving on quickly to look at social media. So Facebook is still the most far-reaching social media service in the UK. That's Facebook on the left there, quite clear. Although it does appear that preferences are shifting. So while Facebook has the greatest reach, the proportion of adults in the UK who say they have an account on that social network has fallen since 2016. And interestingly, there's fewer and fewer people saying it's the only service they use. So 1 in 5, in 2018, only 1 in 5, 20% of people said that Facebook was the only service they used, compared to a third 2 years earlier. Although, of course, a lot of that, from a Facebook point of view, may be compensated by the growth of Facebook-owned WhatsApp and Instagram. Interesting though, looking at the time spent on social network sites. So there's still people spend the sort of levels of engagement, the time spent on Facebook, including Facebook Messenger, is much higher than any other site. So an average of 23 minutes on Facebook amongst Facebook users each day, and that's more than twice as long as the next most time-consuming social media site, which is Snapchat, 9 minutes a day. We've got Google there. I don't really think of Google as being a social media site. But I think it's worth noting that in 2015, users of Facebook spent an average of 39 minutes on the site. So 2015, 39 minutes, 2018, 23 minutes. So there are some challenges facing Facebook. Its reach is falling, average time spent on it is falling, and even while the reach of if its other properties are growing, of Instagram in particular and WhatsApp, users do spend much less time on them than they do and did on Facebook. So my final sort of data slide. So we asked questions about the sources of online harms. Social media was overwhelmingly the main place where people came across harmful content, or not surprisingly, perhaps harmful conduct. So the only sort of harms that we asked about where social networks were not the main source were in relation to viruses, spyware, malicious software, where people reported search engines as being the most commonly cited place to experience it. And just from a sort of fake news point of view, 69% of adults said they'd come across fake news, said they'd seen it on Facebook. We also asked similar questions for 12 to 15-year-olds and found a very similar picture. So, just to summarise, so the top point there, understanding market developments, consumer implications is fundamental to our purpose of making communications markets work for consumers, which is why we are investing in building these data sets. A large proportion of online time is spent on Facebook and Google properties, but overall people do have a varied online diet. Changes in online behaviour are driven by being constantly connected, particularly to mobile. I mean, the one most striking finding in our whole report, I think, is that so 75% of time is spent on mobile devices. And people are unaware of how their data is collected and used. And that point on search, 6.7 billion of ad revenues last year, and for the first time, the majority of revenues came from mobile rather than PC use, but that limited awareness of how search engines are funded. And in social media, just that emphasis that it feels like quite a dynamic market actually, lots of sort of changes in levels of use, but it is absolutely the most common source of consumer harms. As we've done, so I would just urge you, all the data is in our interactive report, so please do go and have a look and send us any feedback, because we'll be publishing this report again next year and hoping to make it bigger and better. Thank you.